Now, more and more parents are falling victim to this crazy gender identity narrative, confusing their children in the name of inclusivity. Take a look.
We didn't assign a gender at birth.
I'm letting this little person be who they want to be.
It is an experiment. What they're doing is unprecedented.
On 60 Minutes.
You can't tell what your gender is by looking at your body.
What are some of the biggest challenges?
Strangers in the street have had quite a strong response. Why are you so obsessed? Why do you need to know?
We're not trying to eliminate gender. It's really helping kids find their own path to it.
So that's a show on 60 Minutes. That clip has gone viral around the world. They're calling them the babies rather than boys or girls babies or some nonsense. But it goes even deeper than that. A new report in the UK from the Policy Exchange shows just how widespread this insidious ideology is. And this report says that 40% of schools in the UK are pushing gender self-identification. That's where your kids say, oh, I'm a boy or I'm a girl or whatever. And only 28% of schools would inform parents, that's you, if their child was gender confused. Joining us to discuss the findings, brilliant Talk TV contributor Esther Krakue. Esther, always great to see you. So this kind of gender madness, you've seen the clip about the Australian TV show about it, but that sparked people in Britain. This one Policy Exchange study showing that nearly half of schools are pushing this stuff.
Yes, I mean, there have been whistleblowers in schools that have been saying that really they're losing the fight to try and keep this sort of gender ideology out of schools. But when you find out that almost half of schools are allowing children to self-ID without parental consent, you really do realize how far this ideology has gone. It is quite worrying just because, this is clearly child abuse. Let's call a spade a spade. The idea of raising your children without gender is patently absurd. You're effectively experimenting with the mental health of your children because you're not giving them any foundational, sense of identity. You're allowing them to go through life as some sort of genderless widget that has no sort of that's not rooted in any sort of reality. And it really is harming children. And the data is very clear. You're effectively priming your children to have mental health issues in the future because you're refusing somehow to let them understand that there is a connection between their sex and their gender. Back in the day, they were literally the same thing in the French language. They're interchangeable. But it's becoming institutionalized, this ideology. And various teachers that are, making this more, making the public more aware of what is going on. They are effectively losing their jobs. I was on a show with a fellow teacher that lost his job as a result of asking, what are the safeguards in place for a student that he had that identified as the opposite gender. And he was effectively struck off because they said that was none of his business. And he asked, has the student's parents been informed? And he's now looking for a job. I mean, it's really insidious. And I don't think people realize how far it's gotten
it's straight out Marxism, Esther. It's straight out Marxism. It reminds us of Pol Pot re-educating children. James?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, this whole push to essentially say that biological reality doesn't exist, that all of these sorts of things, aren't as we thought they were. There's a broader problem here, Esther, that I can see where it's now creating an instability within wider society, that broader society now, because these sort of fundamental pillars of how we understand the world are now being kicked out from underneath us, and especially in the schools. It's creating generational problems. It's causing problems in academia. It's causing problems in the corporate world. What are you seeing in the UK? Because I know that what happens in the UK winds up coming out here to Australia eventually, and you're further down this path than we are. What should we be looking out for?
Well, we should be looking out at the signs of transgenderism as an ideology. I mean, J.K. Rowling made the point that many children that identify as transgender, the overwhelming majority of them do grow out of it, and they either just, identify with their own gender or the sex that they're born with, or they turn out to be gay. But they really, only I think just under 1% of them actually end up being transgender. But I've often observed how the goalposts have moved, because back in the day, to be actually transgender, you were diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which was a legitimate mental health condition, which was was identified by a deep disconnection with the sex that you were born as, and now it's moved to you just depending on how you feel on Tuesday. So if you're one gender on Tuesday and then a garden plant on Thursday, that's perfectly valid. So the goalposts are moving, and kids are suffering at the hands of this because there really is no objective standard. And now we're at the point where we're allowing children to do this without their parents' consent. So really, it is kind of highlighting where this ideology is prevalent in our public life, but also realizing that just because you choose to identify as something doesn't mean that it must be reflected in public policy, because there are real life consequences. Just because you choose to identify as a woman doesn't mean public policy now has to treat you as a woman, because there are many implications with regards to that. With regards to sort of women's spaces and women's shelters, women's prisons, we know the issue of Isla Bryson in Scotland, the trans-identifying rapist who raped 3 women over the course of 5 years, that somehow managed to find himself in a female prison that effectively deposed the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. So there are real world consequences, and it's very important that we call these out, because it's quite an insidious ideology.
Esther, I think you're going to start a fight between James and I, because I disagree very much that
well
the
done,
UK is far down this road. The UK has some resistance to this craziness. Australia doesn't. You mentioned Nicola Sturgeon essentially losing her job over these self-ID laws. Those self-ID laws are in place in places like Victoria.
Yep.
We've got a male-bodied rapist with a functioning penis in Melbourne's biggest female prison right now, despite the objections of many female prisoners. So we don't have it. We don't have the counter to it over there. What I'm worried about isn't just a child saying I'm now a they or a he or a she, but the medicalisation that comes after that. Because as we've seen with the Kira Bell case that went all the way to the High Court in the UK, and what we've learnt about Tavistock, these procedures and treatments, whether we're talking about testosterone or double mastectomies, they are devastating. They can have they do have lifelong consequences and are irreversible in many cases.
Yeah, this is where, transgenderism as an ideology is seeping into public life, because now public policy is reflecting a reality that isn't actually reality. So the idea is if you identify as the opposite sex, now we must medically transition you because that's a form of gender-affirming care. And, this is actually getting worse in England. I mean, the Labour Party are talking about reforming the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, which makes it easier to self-ID as the opposite sex. I mean, we're really not seeing the kind of progress we should be seeing, even after the whole Isla Bryson case and all the various kind of scandals that have happened here in the UK, particularly with regards to the Tavistock clinic. So it is really getting worse. But it's about also drawing a line in the sand. You can identify as however way you wish. You'll be treated with respect and courtesy as you always have been. But in terms of public policy, that is not going to be the reality that's reflected in it, because it actually has dire consequences for a good chunk of the population, primarily women. I don't see many men complaining about, trans men in men's shelters or in men's sports, because it just doesn't exist. This is clearly a threat to women. And the fact that people like J.K. Rowling have been demonized for pointing that out just shows how far we've sunk into this mire of absurdity. The inmates are running the asylum.
Absolutely.